All right, that does it. We're live now, so that makes everything official.
Yeah, that's
Hello,
right.
everyone. I'm John Cavalier from Cavalier House Books, and tonight I'm going to be joined by Mr. Stephen Andes, who's written an awesome book about our good friend Zorro. He's got Zorro's Shadow: How a Mexican Legend Became America's First Superhero. And I'm super excited to talk about this book. I've read a couple passages in it a couple of times because it's given me a lot to think about. And I thank you for being with us tonight.
Hey, man, I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Oh, and I wanted to mention as well to the folks who are watching along on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, any comments that you guys have, just comment and they'll be pulled into our software so that we can make sure that we get all your questions answered. And yeah, so we'll take it away. The first thing that I had on my mind that I was curious about was so when I first got the publicity inquiry about your book several months ago, whenever it was, I saw Zorro and just
Yeah,
I smiled. I was excited.
mind blown.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
was like Zorro, and it's funny because you make a joke several times in the book where you write out the sound of a sword slashing
yep,
with the Zorro slashes. And I swear to you, that was the first thing that popped into my head whenever I saw the
yeah,
email.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. There was like a lot of different onomatopoeic sort of sounds of Z's, and all of a sudden that you mentioned that, the name totally escapes me, but it was actually in a random memoir, and I'd have to look up the name of this author, that the guy, grew up in sort of 1950s America. And so, like, as part of his memoir, that is there, and he used that sort of ZFT sound as his on, and I was like, oh, I'm going to totally take that
Yeah.
because that is like the perfect way to do that. Yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah, my mom and dad actually spent the better part of the last couple of days trying to find a picture of me in all of our old photos. I have and when I was in kindergarten, when I was 5 years old, we had a Mardi Gras parade, and everyone was to come dressed as their favorite character, and I went dressed as Zorro.
yeah,
And my dad made a little hat out of poster paper, and I had the mask and a cape, and I wore rubber boots and dressed all in black and everything. It was
yeah, man.
quite the sight to see. But yeah, so that kind of leads me to sort of the big sort of thing that I was interested in talking to you about, and it's kind of it's just the whole thesis of your book essentially is, you know, that immediate reaction that I had when I saw Zorro, and I was excited, and my immediate reaction is like, Zorro's the coolest, Zorro is awesome. This is going to be so much fun. But then knowing the subsequent whitewashing of the legends that were behind it, and the actual history that goes into things, especially in Spanish California and the annexation of California by the U.S., and all of these different historical ideas that have been just pushed aside and lied about, for a better term, for lack of
Right,
a better term.
right.
Um, I was interested in talking to you because it's difficult to kind of reconcile that, and I'm wondering how. I mean, I certainly know, I get a sense of how you kind of go about that in your head in the book, but I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, basically what you're saying is that it's like Zorro, and then you open the book and it's like, oh, wah wah, like he's a Donnie Downer here. Yeah, no. So I mean, the thing is for me, both of those things can be true, right? That Zorro is awesome. Like my purpose is in the book is not to like tell everybody why the thing that they might love or remember is awful, right? Because I have those memories too, right? I remember everybody, has their sort of Zorro, their epitome of Zorro that they think of, right? Whether it's Antonio Banderas in the 1998 film, or maybe a little bit older generation thinking about Guy Williams as Disney's Zorro. Not too many people think of Douglas Fairbanks anymore from 1920, but at one time, everybody wanted to be Douglas Fairbanks, right?
Right.
But what I saw, or what I began to see in Zorro, was the way in which how how American culture gets made, and probably obviously not just American culture, but because I'm talking about American culture, it's the way in which these things get made that the certain stories are appropriated or made palatable to a certain kind of consumer audience, and that consumer audience in mid-America was mainly white middle-class people, right? And for them, a whiter hero that had lost some of those more sharp edges of the Mexican bandit was something that was much more palatable. And so you see it with other characters, the way in which throughout the 20th century in film, you could see depictions of minorities, of Latinx people or Asian Americans or Black Americans, but they were oftentimes played in blackface or white or in yellow face or brown face, right? These sort of white actors taking on the role of this minority, and because of that, then audiences could identify with them, and Zorro was no different than that. And so it is difficult sometimes to reconcile. And I remember talking to my wife actually about some of the things that I found out about Johnston McCulley, the writer of Zorro. And she was like, oh, gosh, are you sure you want to even write about this? Because nobody's going to want to buy your book because nobody's going to like Zorro after this, right? After they, find out some of the storied past of Johnston McCulley, the writer, and his being, basically convicted of rape in 1909 and stuff. Sorry, I guess I'm sort of throwing these bombs out there, but
yeah, you write in the book that the character of Zorro masked a lot of things in its history: racial violence, settler colonialism, the context of California and annexation, and even the sexual violence of Johnston McCulley. And that was really the thing that I came away with from your book, is how you talk about code switching, you talk about dual identity, and you talk about Zorro and his mask and his dual identity as a character. And Zorro the character is a mask for history, just like Don. He wears a mask to protect his identity. And so that's it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks whenever you're connecting all of these little dots throughout.
Yeah. I mean, like part of the thing for me was, this isn't at all trying to be something that's political, but I remember, in the run up to the 2016 election, hearing, a lot of the rhetoric coming out about Mexican immigration, for instance, and it struck me as obviously I was horrified by it in just on a human sense, but also from as a historian, but then also as somebody that cares about pop culture, saying, hey, wait a second, actually, when we take a step back, Mexican Americans are constitutive of what makes America America just as much as Anglo Americans or other groups are, right? And so Zorro was this case in point for me, as a way to say, here's this thing like this superhero, the American superhero that we think is apple pie and superheroes, right? That has a real kind of sense of Americanness to it. And I realized that not a lot had been written on Zorro, and so it intrigued me to find out more about the origins of this character. If Zorro was potentially a prototype for later superheroes like Batman and Superman and such, then could Zorro himself have a prototype, an actual character? And that sort of sent me on this journey to look at some of those origins and try to investigate what were some of the stories that had been covered up about the gold rush in California, the sort of legend around Joaquin Murrieta, the guy that I argue in the book is sort of the main inspiration for Zorro. And I hope it actually gives Well, my desire is that it gives hope to the idea that the legends and stories that we grow up with, myths in many ways, are things that need not be static, right? That all of these legends are things that we can begin to reframe and tell anew to give life to what we think about ourselves and the story we want to tell about ourselves, right? So, like exposing some of the old myths for what they are, but then actually building something new, a new story, a new dialogue around those old characters.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of when I'm doing events like this. I like to write down quotes from the book because I like just the little nuggets of wisdom that I find in books. But I
Wisdom.
also love them.
What? There was wisdom in there. I don't know.
Yeah, just a couple of nuggets at least. Yeah. But yeah, and they're also just great like little conversation prompts. And so another along those lines, another quote that I wrote down was part of Zorro's evolution was about the kind of legend Americans wanted to hear. And with you talking about how that's not a static thing, I think that's a really great way to phrase it. Where we want to hear different legends, we want to hear more inclusive legends, we want to hear more exemplary legends that aren't just
Right.
kind of lowest common denominator sort of thing. We want those intricacies and we want that nuance, and I think that's a great part of that's a great part of the conversation that you tell in the book and about how that's being achieved in Zorro.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, all of this is obviously the specifics are kind of all about Zorro in this book, but the larger conversation is just everything. Is think about Chadwick Boseman, passing away, and the the power that his life represented to so many as this, Black Panther, as this superhero that represented a whole new retelling of what a superhero could be or look like or do, right? And shatters the sort of monochromatic, idea of superhero-ness. And so in some ways it's probably good that the first, uh, sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe has come to an end with sort of sunsetting the old Captain America, the old uh, Iron Man, because there's more suits out there to be filled, and that represent the full sort of spectrum of America, right? There's this Glenn Weldon, this guy who wrote this book on Batman, said, all Comic Cons are the same. It's just it's the same passion dressed up in different suits, right? And the problem, though, is when we don't accept. There's not enough suits to go around, right? And so that's why somebody like a Chadwick Boseman or somebody like a Miles Morales or a Kamala Khan, these other characters are so vital and so important, because they begin to show American diversity within this sort of larger superhero story.
Right. Well, a person that you quote in the book as well is you quote towards the end David Avalone, the writer of Zorro's Sword of Hell, which is which is something that I haven't read, but it's something I'm definitely going to read because
it's my favorite Zorro comic by far, definitely.
But yeah, it definitely you made it sound worth picking up for sure. But yeah, there's no such thing as forced diversity. There's only forced lack of diversity. Is the quote that you use in the book, and thinking about that and thinking about the lack of the static nature that you're talking about. What are some of the without recounting the entire book, but what are kind of some of the high points about some of the historical context that you think a lot of the Zorro story gets wrong?
That's good. Yeah, no, that's a deep question. So I think, when we think, so let's say that Joaquin Murrieta, this, and for those of you out there that, haven't read my book or whatever, or know anything about Joaquin Murrieta, he himself is a legendary character, right? That many historians, myself included, haven't been able to establish all the facts of his life. So there's like legends built on legends here, but there's a core realness or truth to Murrieta's life, in that he represents the plight of so many, Mexicans that were living on the border of the United States. The Mexican-American War happens. 40% of what was once Mexico becomes part of the United States. And so these folks that are living in California, all of a sudden, they're on foreign territory and treated as foreigners, whereas, for generations, people had gone there and, lived as Mexicans, right? And so the story about Murrieta is that his wife was raped, his brother-in-law was lynched, and that drove him into a life of banditry. And the popular myth, even of the time, was that, written about in newspapers, was that, Joaquin was not only a bandit, but somewhat of an avenger, right? That he would try, almost like a Robin Hood-esque character, right? Righting the wrongs, robbing from the rich, giving to the poor, et cetera, and so forth. And then came the time when he was hunted down by California Rangers, and then decapitated, his head brought in to get the bounty. And then, sort of in this gruesome, macabre way, his head was shipped around to various sideshows throughout the state. You could pay $1 to get in and see the head of Joaquin Murrieta. Right. And, this is just like awesome, awful violence. Right. And the reality is that whether or not it was Joaquin Murrieta's head in that jar, right? There was the head of a Mexican in that jar. There was somebody that was decapitated, right? And so when you think about this, what do we get wrong about the story of Zorro? I think from there, legends about Murrieta begin to shed those more gruesome or really painful, traumatic parts of the story. Pretty soon, Murrieta is more aristocratic. He's oftentimes whiter. He's talked about, he's fair-haired and blue-eyed. He comes from Sonora, so perhaps some of those sort of phenotypes were in his heritage. And by the time Johnston Macaulay gets a hold of him, Murrieta is actually, in one story, in one novel written about in the early 20th century, before Macaulay writes in his Zorro stories, Murrieta is actually fighting on the side of the Americans against Mexicans, right? And so it's like a total reversal of roles. And so by the time Zorro gets created, Zorro is in many ways a kind of type of proto-American in old California that was against the corruptness of the Spanish and sometimes even of the Mexicans, and therefore would be welcoming of American annexation, right? And so one of the things that, and you can see this, for instance, in The Mask of Zorro in 1998, Zorro, played by Antonio Banderas, is actively supportive of the drive for American statehood for California, which was not the story of Murrieta, which was not the story of that sort of image. And so when you're talking about what the story gets wrong, it's basically taking this hero and making him supportive of American statehood in California. So that's definitely something that I found out and was able to write about and try to expose as a myth, that it was, if there's a hero in old California, he's going to embody the same kind of ideals that Americans have, right? Not something that is in antipathy to American ideals, right, or American desires or designs of westward expansion, of manifest destiny, right? And so, here, when we're talking about heroes in old California, or in the time of the Mexican gold rush, at least, those heroes that look like Zorro were definitely not pro-American annexation, right? If anything, they were against it and fought against it.
Right. Yeah. You wrote in the book that the Mask of Zorro was the closest, kind of the closest thing. But yeah, you point out all of these different flaws where, historically it is just kind of a corrupted sort of telling of it. And that's one of the things, that's honestly one of the reasons why I think your book and books like it are really important to the retelling of this sort of mythology that we have around everything. Because it so governs the current conversations that we have. And so I find it endlessly fascinating, because like you were talking about with Murrieta and all of the different newspaper accounts that kind of culminate into this one sort of hero that no one
Right.
knows, no one's
Right.
ever seen, and but there's a legend about it. And so I think it's important to examine that, and it's also just it's endlessly fascinating. I find that you bring up the Murrieta's head in a jar of alcohol, and when you're telling that story earlier in the book, I immediately think of the Mask of Zorro and the scene
Right.
where Antonio Banderas takes a sip
Right.
from I'm just
Right. Yeah. Right.
and all of these like true macabre facts of history, sort of hit you in a different way, because it wasn't just something that was done for, it was done for an effect in the movie, but
Sure.
certainly knowing the history behind it, you understand that it has a more profound effect.
Right. Yeah. And, um, to talk about Murrieta, even if we could say that, we could, and one of the things that I found out very quickly was, when you delve into the history of Murrieta, it is like an endless, bottomless pit, because there is so much myth upon story upon legend. And that's what this filmmaker John Valadez, who did a short documentary on the head of Joaquin Murrieta, and that's what he told me when like I interviewed him and stuff like that, was like, once you enter into this story, like everything, nothing is going to begin to make sense. And so even if you could say that story is totally not true, right? Which I think you can't, because there are elements that are very, verified. But even if you could, the reality is that, like other historians have shown, how, through after the Civil War, there was almost 1,000 documented case of lynchings of Mexican people in 13 western states after the American Civil War, right? And so this wasn't just something that was confined to a one legend, but it was that this legend represented another fact of American life that is totally uncomfortable to talk about, and to be able to learn that it's attached to Zorro. But the reality is that Latinx folks suffered and continue to suffer under persecution, and and they survive, and they thrive, and they resist, right? And so that's the importance of Zorro's story, and that's why Zorro matters, is because Zorro is real, right? Not that there was an actual guy named Don Diego de la Vega, but what that sort of history of resistance represents, even though at times was whitewashed, even times was co-opted into a whitewashed narrative. It still carries that sort of that core of that truth, right? And so that's why it was seemed like it was pretty relevant to me in this day and age, right? And perhaps it was a different way to talk about our current moment in a way that wasn't just talking about politics, right? But yeah, like I think it's something that that we can all hopefully see that it infects all of our life, right? The stories that we tell, that we that make us feel good about who we are as people, as Americans, right? And perhaps we need to question those myths, see what's true, what's false, and
Right.
at that point move on, right?
Yeah. So you chronicle, you chronicle from, the legends of Joaquin Murrieta into Zorro and all the different iterations of Zorro, and it's kind of the reclamation of some of his Latinx roots, and especially going into contemporary times now, where there are definitely more artists, more comic book artists, more filmmakers that are you know um, being truer to a lot of these
Yeah.
ideas and questioning a lot of these ideas that we've kind of held as fact for so long. What do you think? What do you think the future of Zorro is going to be? What do you think? And I don't mean like Zorro in space or anything like that, but what do you
Right.
think? Like, how do you see that reconciliation of Zorro, sort of in the bigger picture, culturally, with a lot of the other big issues
Sure.
that need to be reconciled?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of those things that I think has already begun, which is if we're actually going to be real about it, the one of the things that I think has been pointed out to me by many other people is this notion of, when you want to inject sort of authenticity or diversity into a character, it's also about looking at like what's natural or has been overlooked in the past, right? So, to put a half black, half Puerto Rican Spider-Man makes sense when you're talking about the Brooklyn, New York, the Bronx, right? But to make sort of Batman, which I remember hearing Keith Chow, a guy who runs the blog Nerds of Color, say that Batman's superpower is his white privilege, right? Right. So like that, like there's like this sense of like it's hard to make Batman not super white and super privileged, because that's his background, right? That's his milieu, right? But when we talk about Zorro, right, like it's a myth that says that the most of the original Spanish settlers were of this like pure blue-blooded Spanish heritage. Most of them were mestizos. Most of them were people of color, indigenous, black, and Spanish. Sort of mestizos, mestizas, right? And so to make Don Diego mestizo, sort of, and this is what Isabel Allende did in her novel, and David Avalone did in his comic, was his father is Spanish and his mother is of an indigenous tribe from the California area, right? And that at least begins to build a mythology that takes account of actually the real historical origins. So even though Zorro's Swords of Hell, this comic book, and I write about this in the book, is a fantastical tale, a horror tale of sort of spirits rising from the La Brea tar pits, in many ways it's more historically accurate in its depiction of Don Diego as this sort of mixed heritage individual than Guy Williams in Disney's Zorro, right? And so I think what Zorro looks like going forward then is somebody of biracial heritage or of mixed ancestry, somebody that is going to be somewhat torn and conflicted about the privilege of the Spanish when taken into consideration his roots within indigenous culture, right? And he's going to have to play both of those worlds and figure out where he sits in that. When he's fighting for the rights of the oppressed and downtrodden, is he going to have to, make a choice to, is it a reform of the system or an overthrow of the system? Zorro has always been ultimately a supporter of the status quo, right? To put things back in order instead of overthrowing the system. So, but I think there's talks about putting Zorro in sort of a post-apocalyptic future where, in some ways, the West reappears, right? Because civilization is kind of fallen to the wayside, and sort of, there was a lot of talk that perhaps in the same way that the Mask of Zorro was Anthony Hopkins sort of bequeathing the mask to Antonio Banderas, that a sort of male Zorro could bequeath the mask to a female character, for instance. So I think there's the real answer is that what the future holds will only be interesting if it's not just written about by people like that look like me. If it's written by people of color, if it's written by Black artists, Latinx artists, women, right? People all along, the diversity that makes America America. So I think that portends something truly interesting for the character, and not just sort of a stale remake of what's already been done.
I would watch any of those movies, so I look forward to those being produced.
Yeah.
But yeah, we actually have a question from Mr. Blake Canfield. He says, "Steve, can't wait to finish your book. Started last night. How is Zorro seen in Mexican popular culture? Is he well known? Is he perceived negatively, positively? Is there a mix?"
Good. Yeah. So that was one of the things that I thought was somewhat surprising. I thought Zorro was going to be he is definitely well known in Mexico, but more popular, right? And what I realized was that Zorro is in many ways becomes a popular in America as this sort of whitewashed reflection of what old California was like, right? And so there are definitely the idea of a masked Avenger is throughout Mexican pop culture, but you see it much more so, for instance, within lucha libre, within the luchador sort of masked identity, kind of both live action sport, but also in luchador movies, comics, etc. And Zorro is kind of distant, right? He's kind of off. You think of California, it's also was the extreme north of Mexico at one time. And so I was actually surprised that, so I'll say it this way. If you go to Mexico City and you go to one of the outdoor markets and there's lots and lots of pop culture that might be around, you never see Zorro stuff in Mexico, right? You will see lots of luchador masks. You will see other sort of popular heroes that wear masks and stuff like that. But very seldom do you see Zorro stuff. And so in that way, he's sort of like an American appropriation of a Mexican character, right? Perhaps in the same way that like a Speedy Gonzalez is more ubiquitous in the United States because he reflects an American creation of this, Mexican character, right?
Right. Well, and we've got another one that just came in as well from Cody Hosley. If you were the director for a Zorro film that was going to reboot the franchise, what film would you make?
I like it. Okay. So, if I was going to reboot the franchise, what film would you make? I would, honestly, I really would love to be Quentin Tarantino, because he, I mean, that probably can be taken in a lot of different ways. The reason I say that is because I'm really excited because there was a comic book that was a crossover between Django and Zorro. Django Unchained, his movie character, and there was a comic book that put Django and Zorro together, and so I think it would. And there's talks that they're actually going to make that film. I think it's probably not in production yet, but I would love to make that movie because I think it does get at this notion of what is justice and for whom, right? Is it justice to uphold a system, or is it justice that the only way to bring about justice is to bring that system down, right? There's a real tension in that, where Django represents this character that's saying justice is overthrowing, the slave society of the South, right? And Zorro is, he's like, well, we have to do it a little bit more, flexibly, and pretend that I'm, this fop, this aristocrat by day, and by night, I make sure that justice comes, right? But not really overthrowing the system. And I think that would really stretch the narrative of Zorro in a new way and cause Zorro to have to question, what am I bringing justice to? Is it just to a corrupt system that's going to continue to do this, or is it something that the system itself has to go, right? So that's something that I think I could see Zorro having to ask, and I don't know what the end of the movie would look like, but I'm open to suggestions.
Well, if it's a Quentin Tarantino movie,
right.
everyone's
right.
dead
Everybody's
at the
dead,
end of the
right?
movie.
Yeah. In a sort of extra gory cinematic way as well.
Yeah. So a couple of other questions that I had. The guy on the cover of your book, Mr. Guy Williams.
Yep.
The Disney show, that is how I got into Zorro when I was a kid. I remember watching the reruns, and I remember watching them every time that they came on. And it was the same thing with, for me, it was the same thing with the Adam West Batman reruns. I watched them endlessly. And so I think it's really interesting how you kind of point out the sort of Disneyfication and the commodification of Zorro. Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of Zorro as a property, as like a franchise, or that sort of Disneyfication sort of had not just a lasting impact on the character itself, but on kind of the way that we engage with kind of the history that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, I mean, Walt Disney was nothing if not a myth maker, right? That's what, he was an Imagineer. And there's, Walt Disney is, people have written lots and lots on Walt Disney, but, so on the one hand, like, Walt Disney did a solid in that he took this story that was not just your average Western, right? As Westerns were big, he had just done Davy Crockett. And, in the mid 1950s, everybody was wearing the coonskin cap, right? I remember having one growing up, etc. And then his next thing that he did was Zorro. And so, we've seen recent movies like the Mary Poppins one about saving Mr. Banks, right? How Walt Disney got the rights to the Mary Poppins stuff, how he got rights to other, Alice in Wonderland, right? All these kind of different stories. And he also got the stories from Johnston and Macaulay, right? He bought part of the rights to Zorro to do that. And so it was like bringing up these old stories. And one of my good friends, Javier Hernandez, who's a comics writer, he writes El Muerto. And if you've never seen El Muerto, the comic book, you should check it out. But he talks about growing up, and he was like, for him, like as a Latino guy growing up in California, like when he turned on the TV, he was like, oh yeah, I'm like, he resonated with the Zorro character, right? That was the only guy that sort of looked and, maybe was like him on TV. And so he was into it. And so there was a sense that Zorro inspired a generation of Latinx people, right? But on the other hand, there was this huge commodification, as you said, of the brand, right? Zorro became something you could purchase, not only the mask, the sword, the hat, right? But on some odd thing called TV socks. I found there was this thing that it was like the Zorro branded TV socks. I don't know what it had to do with Zorro, but they put, like a Zorro Z on it, and they sold it, right? And in that way, there was a commodification of the history of old California, which, as we've already talked about, was a fantasy. And he talks about it as such. The first time that he presents Zorro on the 4th anniversary show, he's like, it was back in old California, where slow guitar and romance, and there was this character Zorro, right? And that's fine. I'm not like against like imagining stuff, or like coming up with imaginative stories. But the reality is that it commodified a myth that in some ways covered up a real history of Mexican Americans in California that wasn't being told. And so I think that was solidified with Disney's Zorro, because Disney or Zorro was big before that. But once Zorro got the property, Guy Williams, even today, obviously Guy Williams is the Zorro for so many people. And, Guy Williams was the son of Italian immigrants. Armand Catalano changed his name to Guy Williams so that he could get, acting parts. And so he was not of Mexican or Spanish ancestry. I guess there was a little bit of, I think, Basque in his background. But yeah, like, then there was the way in which there was a curated ethnicity to Zorro. So Guy Williams, a guy that didn't know Spanish, maybe knew some Italian from his parents, in rehearsals, he would, lay on a thick Spanish accent, and in the background, Walt Disney would be like, can you bring it down, Guy? Bring it down. Right. And so he would, bring down the accent, and then he would bring it down, and he's like, no, can you bring it up, Guy? Can you bring it up? Right. And so there was like this, what is the perfect sound that will be palatable enough to, white English speaking audiences, but also kind of just exotic enough to be something that people are interested in.
Yeah, I've thought that was a really funny point that you made in the book about on the set of the Disney show, how they would have people on set to make sure that the Spanish pronunciation of words was executed correctly, but then they would modulate the accent.
Right.
And it's like, okay, it's like, all right, step forward. Oh, step back.
Right. And so, for instance, like one of the most fascinating characters to me was the guy who played Don Alejandro, the father of Don Diego in the Zorro TV show. His name was George Lewis. And he was a Mexican American guy that spoke English fine, but he actually had to affect a Spanish accent in the role of Don Alejandro. And so there's, like these different ways in which these kind of things get commodified and sort of performed, right? Performing a certain ethnicity that that then is more aristocratic, whereas everybody knows the portrayal, for instance, in the 1940s in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, the actor, who has the famous line, we don't need no stinking badges, right? That becomes a sort of vision of Mexico that is oftentimes derided or has to associated with banditry, et cetera, and so forth. And so so all of that to say that Zorro commodifies and sort of merchandises a kind of Spanish fantasy heritage of California that can then be bought and sold and rerun. And that's the image that gets implanted in the American imagination about the history, real or fictional, of the relationship of Spain to America or Mexico to America.
Yeah, it's an interesting world we live in.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Got another question that came in through Facebook, and this will actually be a good question, a good final question to wrap things up with. But Jeff Marriott asks, do you have another project underway or in the research phase?
Yes. So I have a couple projects. One is I'm actually writing a fiction, a novel of fiction, a post-apocalyptic novel during COVID. What better time than to write my novel? So we'll see. That what's that?
Current event.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Even though my agent told me, actually, nobody wants to read anything about viral apocalypse. So I think it'll just be something that I'm doing for myself. But then the actual next project that I really want to work on, and I sort of let it out there. I was going to say the cat out of the bag, which is probably not a good metaphor here, but is a book on Speedy Gonzales. Oh, okay. And sort of in many ways, the sort of depiction of Speedy Gonzales is both, on the one hand, he's the character of this mouse. He's reputed as the fastest mouse in all of Mexico, but there's a darker side to the history of Speedy Gonzales that has been told by scholars, but hasn't really been told in a more sort of digestible way by a larger audience. And so I hope to tell that story. And the thing that I can leave you with is that the name Speedy Gonzales actually comes from a dirty joke that went around Southern California at the time. And so it kind of tells you the way in which this character was formed within this mixture of, of sort of xenophobia / racial characterization, right? But so yeah, it can be, hopefully it'll not make people so uncomfortable that they don't want to read the book, but also hopefully question the mystery or the some of the myths that we tell ourselves.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. That'll be interesting to read. I mean, just thinking back, you said Speedy Gonzales, and I immediately started thinking about like the other mice that are there, and they're always like these stereotypical, like they're like asleep, and stuff like that. And it's like, just surface level. Surface level is problematic. So I'm sure if you bother to do more than scratch the surface, you'll find plenty of problems with it.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, good deal. Well, I thank you so much for talking to us tonight. I thank you so much for your book. It was an awesome read. It was a fun read. It was it was a difficult read at times because, yeah, I mean, you do kind of have some of your illusions shattered about some of the history of this character that you love. But I mean, I also think it's necessary and important. So definitely thank you very much for talking to us, and I thank you for the book itself.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Sean. I
Awesome.
appreciate it, man.
Well, have a good night, everybody.
All right.